This is Bud Hayden, live from Pequod Caverns, where I'll be reporting on the apparent disappearance of a Grant University student, the victim of a seemingly innocent game, Mazes and Monsters. Now, Mazes and Monsters is a fantasy role-playing game in which the players create an imaginary character. These characters are then plunged into a fantasy world of invented terrors. The point of the game is to amass a fortune without being killed. It's kind of a psychodrama, you might say, where these people deal with problems in their lives by acting them out. But in this case, there might be a loss of distinction between reality and fantasy, and possibly the loss of life in the process. I'll be back in 3 minutes with another live report.
In 1982, Tom Hanks was starring his first leading role in the television movie Mazes and Monsters. Setting off a fear that was already growing of teens playing Dungeons and Dragons, parents were being led to believe that the game could lead to devil-worshipping, suicide, murder, and even unprotected sex. Each decade, it seems we were hit with a new evil that was trying to take over the minds of our children. In the 60s, it was comic books. In the 70s, it was rock and roll. And there were no greater threat in the eyes of middle-class mothers than the devil himself. And he was still in rock music and creeping into television and movies and even action figures.
The many faces in this little toy which change, but you can become a skeleton creature and we could go around to the different faces. And this has got to have some kind of a message to the children.
Oh, definitely. It says you can be demon-possessed and still be good.
And now, role-playing games. The television movie premiered on CBS in 1982 and started a buzz with the media that this was a movie that all parents should watch. Tom Hanks starred as Robbie Willing, the headmaster of a group of college students who all play the fictionary role-playing game Mazes and Monsters. The group all had personal problems, and they would use the game to escape or deal with their issues. As they played the game more and more, it began to take over their life, and it was no longer a game played at a table, as the game master was now taking the game outside of the basement and playing in dangerous locations throughout the city. As each friend playing the game saw their character starting to merge into real life, believing they were magical characters that they had invented inside the game. This led to attempts in suicide, murder, and Tom Hanks believing he could jump off the Twin Towers and use a casting spell to not be harmed.
Going to join the Great Hall.
You can't. It's a trap.
I have spells. I'm going to fly.
You don't have enough points. I am the maze controller.
Maze controller?
Yes. And I have absolute authority in this game.
Game?
Game.
TJ, what am I doing here? Kate, why can't I remember?
Luckily, his character was saved at the last minute by his quick-thinking friends who would use the game's rules to stop him from jumping to his death. The TV movie was based on a novel of the same name written by Ronna Jeffrey from 1981, releasing at a time when role-playing Hysteria was at a peak. Jeffrey wrote her book after reading reports of a 16-year-old Michigan State University student who went missing after playing Dungeons and Dragons. James Dallas Egbert III was a child prodigy who attended Michigan State University at the age of 16, where he majored in computer science. In 1979, James disappeared from his dorm room. After no one seen him for a few days, his parents hired private investigator William Deere. Deere learned that James loved to play Dungeons and Dragons, and that led at times for he and his friends to play a more live-action version of the game at locations throughout the college. And while noticing a push-pin pattern on a board in James' room, Deere realized that it was an overview of the college. This led Dean to investigate steam tunnels located under the college. There he would find signs that someone had been there recently and was sure that it was James. When Deere was asked about the investigation in the media, this is where the media took the story of Dungeons and Dragons and ran with it. Speaking to the media, Deere disclosed his theories on what happened to James. That James went into the steam tunnels under the college to take his own life, and that he was aware of the tunnels due to playing Dungeons and Dragons. However, Dare would leave out that James had a slew of personal problems, including depression, loneliness, parental pressure, drug addiction, and coming to terms with being a homosexual.
Dungeons & Dragons is one of over 300 fantasy role-playing games on the market today. At least 4 million players have accepted the invitation to enter into the fantasy dream world of sorcery, swords, and demons.
Well, actually, the figure by the National Coalition on Television Violence is documented more than 125 cases of either suicide or murder directly attributable to Dungeons & Dragons.
To the media, all they wanted to hear about was the story of a young man who played Dungeons & Dragons and disappeared while playing it at the college. As other media outlets started to pick up the story, it would snowball and more blame was being put on the role-playing game. A few weeks later, Private Detective Dare would get an anonymous phone call that told him the location of James. It seemed James had been hiding out at an older friend's house for the last few weeks, but was now in New Orleans. Although Dare did believe that James was in New Orleans, he had a hard time locating him. That was until James himself called the investigator, and they arranged to meet up and that James would be placed in the custody of his uncle. While talking with James, Dare learned that he did attempt suicide by taking sleeping pills in the college tunnel system. But after a long sleep, he awoken and went to stay at the home of his friend, an older man that had become friends with James. This older man, fearing the attention and implications of his relationship with James, did not tell anyone that James was staying at his place, and then would help James hide to another place in Michigan, and then finally help him take a trip to New Orleans. While in hiding, James made another attempt to end his life, but it was also unsuccessful, and he took a job in an oil field until he met with Dare. As the two talked more about James's issues with his parents, school, drugs, and his sexuality, made it clear that Dungeons & Dragons played no part at all in his attempted suicide or him running away. However, the real story seemed to go unheard, as parent groups and others were screaming how Dungeons & Dragons was causing more harm than good to young kids everywhere.
D&D is morally deficient, it's spiritually corrupt, it is educationally evil, it teaches evil, and it is potentially dangerous. And the road to the ideals it represents leads to destruction, and that's the only place they lead. I should know.
The media had an angle. The Dungeons & Dragons game was more exciting than a kid with personal problems running away. But it really didn't help to calm fears that Dale agreed with James and his parents to keep the details of his personal problems a secret, causing the blame of Dungeons & Dragons to grow.
Spotlight interview features Clyde Taylor, who was 10 years old when his cousins introduced him to a game, Dungeons & Dragons. In the 8th grade, he started drinking and doing drugs, and it was during that time that he met a friend, Snake, who introduced him to Satanism. He joined a satanic group known as the Sons of Satan. The group had grown in size to nearly 1,500 people, some as young as 11 years old.
James would change schools and try to get back to a normal life. Private Investigator Dare would remain in contact with James and become a good friend and advisor.
He was a publicity hound, and he knew that he could hang it on D&D and gather a lot of media frenzy, and he did.
However, sadly, at the age of 17, James would take his own life in August of 1980, 1 year and a day after going missing. A year later, Ron Jeffries' novel, inspired by the James case, Mazes and Monsters, was released, after taking only 3 days to write. And then, a year later, the Tom Hanks television movie would air. In 1982, teenager Ivan Pulling took his own life, and his mother would blame Dungeons & Dragons, and would form BAD, Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons, to bring awareness that the game was causing to children. A year after that, Private Investigator Dare released his own book on the case, called Dungeon Master, in an effort to set the record straight, outlining the conversation he had with James, and playing down the involvement of Dungeons & Dragons, and letting people know of the personal problems James had that led to his death.
You have eyewitnesses. For instance, one case, the parents saw their child summon Dungeons & Dragons demons into his room before he killed himself. Another case, the kid thought he had the ability to astral travel, coming from the Dungeons & Dragons game, that he could leave his body and come back. And he had rigged it up just according to the rule book so he could do it. He was surrounded by his materials and put a bullet in his head so he could leave his body, and he's never come back.
However, the panic of playing Dungeons & Dragons would not slow down, with mothers telling horror stories on talk shows and even in courtrooms. The stigma of playing Dungeons & Dragons would stick around for years to come. As the kids of the 80s grew up, Parents of the 90s would blame video games rather than the skills of being a parent. And then the parents of the 2000s would blame the internet. The story of James shouldn't be about Dungeons and Dragons. If the game leads to devil worshipping, it should be a reminder to all the parents out there, rather than worry about what the kids are playing to escape their problems, be it Dungeons and Dragons, video games, or even surfing the internet. The parents should talk and listen to their kids' problems. They will find that the problems the kids are having are linked to a lot more than playing a game.
Mazes and Monsters is a far-out game. Swords, poison, spells, battles, maiming, killing.
Hey, it's all imagination.
Is it?
Well, I want to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please thumb up so I know you like my content. Subscribe to the channel, and we'll talk again soon.
And so, we played the game again, for one last time. It didn't matter that there were no maps, or dice, or no monsters. Pardieu saw the monsters. We did not. We saw nothing but the death of hope, and the loss of our friend. And so we played the game until the sun began to set, and all the monsters were dead.
Junkman. Thank you, sir, for that unsolicited testimony.